We all present and accounted for. Is everybody still in the testing room? So as I mentioned before, and I'm not sure how this is going to work out for the remainder of the semester, because your schedule is so daunting. Oftentimes, Professor Patch will have, I know you think your 12 o'clock period is your sacrosanct lunchtime. She may have things scheduled for you that will even preclude our ability to review a test. But for now, let's say we'll do the following. Because I guess because she's not here, we don't have to worry about it. But in general, the day after the test, because I just don't have time to review them, especially when things start a little late, plan on a test review unless you have some conflict, in which case, I know last summer, the students sometimes just gave up because they had such difficulty trying to schedule the reviews. So we'll schedule this review for noon tomorrow. The PA program requirements are that for 10 minutes, and so I'm not sure why it makes any difference if we do it here or there. I think we can just do it here. For 10 minutes, everybody needs to remain in the classroom together. What they're concerned about is people copying web pages, copying, doing screenshots, and that sort of thing. So probably another person will come here to proctor, will open the test for 10 minutes. And then if somebody wants to leave, they can. But if anybody leaves, I need to close the test. If you want to stay longer, that's fine. I'll keep it open as long as you want. Having said that, remember the overriding principle is you're welcome to come by the office whenever you're free, before class, after class. And I'll be happy to go open up the test. There's a computer in there. You can spend as much time as you want with it. And I'll go over the test with you there individually. If things didn't go well this time, we need to correct it now. I have no idea how many of you did or what the average is. But if things didn't go well, because this course, both of these courses move so rapidly, we need to address that now. You can't just wait for something magical to happen on the next test. So keep that in mind. Don't become discouraged or upset. Just resolve to do something about it. I will be available as you need. If you find out that I can't talk grades, but you have find a classmate that did well in the test, and you can work with them. But let's be sure we get to whatever issues or problems are present corrected. So we get tomorrow at noon, unless we hear otherwise. Okay, it's Anatomy Monday. The first session is anatomy. And recall that we were talking about the cranial bones, the cranial skeleton. So you need to know virtually all the bones. You need to know all the bones we mentioned. You need to be able to name the plate bones, the calvarium, the bones of the calvarium, the bones of the basic cranium. Remember, we left off with a little Ackland video where he was discussing the sphenoid bone. And we said that the sphenoid is important because it lies there at the base, the central base of the cranium. And in that position, it is involved in everything from the endocrine system, the neurovascular system. We have all kinds of neural structures passing through there, both blood drainage from the brain and blood supply to the brain are present in that region. So we want to pay attention, and we want to come back and revisit that a little bit as well, if this is what I'm saying. Now, moving on from that, we're looking once again here at the basic cranium, looking at the bottom of the skull from above. So always in these illustrations, make sure you orient yourself first. So we're looking at the bottom of the skull from above, and this is the perspective we saw to a large extent in the Ackland video. And several key features you want to pay attention to initially. Be sure you can differentiate the anterior, middle, and posterior fossa. We talked about the structures that rest in each of those regions. As you look at this, remember all of this in here is the sphenoid. This is the lesser wing of the sphenoid right here where that arrow is pointing out the superior orbital fissure. Well, that ridge there is the lesser wing or the least wing of the sphenoid. And then remember there were 4 clinoid processes. There are 2 anterior processes This would be the anterior, one of the anterior processes, one of the anterior processes, and the two posterior here. And those serve as very important and useful landmarks for the hypophyseal fossa. And that's that depression that you see right there, into which the pituitary gland is positioned. Now, as we pointed out, in this area, what we're going to find also is that the internal carotid artery, the major artery that supplies blood to the brain, makes a crazy turn in here. It goes one direction and all of a sudden turns back. This, as you might imagine, presents problems for blood flow, and it's not uncommon for the blood supply to the brain in this region, where the two major vessels come together, the internal carotid and the vertebral arteries. It's not uncommon with all this angularity for aneurysms, for plaques, and various other problems to develop. And as we've indicated, central neural structures, endocrine system, venous drainage, all right there together. So if something goes wrong, it can involve a lot of other systems as well. So be aware of that central location. Of course, as we continue our discussion, remember up in here too, wrapped around that pituitary gland, or at least what's called pituitary stalk, are the optic processes, the optic nerves, and what's called the optic chiasm. There's wraps right around that. So and it wouldn't be said. In many cases, again, a vascular issue, pituitary tumor, it shouldn't surprise you that maybe vision is involved as well. Maybe vision is compromised. Just a lot of things going on there. Now, in the next few slides, there's also a brief discussion of some of these, hesitate to prioritize these, but some of the more visible, more evident basicranial foramina. Remember, these are the apertures of the holes. And we can see, for example, 3 of them here, and they're indicated. These 3 I do want you to know. In fact, there's a slide coming up that summarizes the foramina that you need to know for the next test. But keep in mind that as we're looking at the floor of the skull from the inside, that when we flip this over and try to examine or find these foramina, they may be in a different relative position there. So you don't always assume that that the other side of the skull is going to have these foramina in the same relative position. But these 3 I do want you to know. We'll talk about these in more detail in just a moment. Now, obviously, for me to ask you to identify these, I need to give you a fairly clear and evident image or illustration. And here you can see these three medical students sometimes learn these as ROS, Ross. Foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and foramen spinosum. And then there are a couple others. You can see the superior orbital fissure here. It's kind of useful to remember those together, because between the orbital fissure and the rotundum and ovale, those are the apertures, those are the pathways for the 3 branches of cranial nerve 5. So it's kind of useful to keep that straight. 1, 2, 3. So we have V1 of the first of the cranial nerve branches, the ophthalmic branch going through there. Second one here, V2, maxillary, and then the mandibular. And then the foramen spinosum is important because, remember we talked a little bit about the middle meningeal artery? Anybody remember the significance? Yeah, basically, it's a little bit of an odd creature, but it basically perfuses the interior, the immediate interior and dura of the skull. And what is the vulnerable region of the skull under which it passes?
Temporal.
The pteria. Yeah, the pteria. Now, so we've talked about this region. There's a region back here called the foramen lacerum. I'll just mention some of these. You have other illustrations where they're pointed out, but it's very prominent here. And the most medial point of that foramen lacerum is the carotid canal. As I say, the carotid artery takes a rather anfractuous or tortured route from one side of the skull to the other. We'll look at that. And then there are a couple other apertures we'll point out a little bit later.
Can you spell that?
Which one?
That one under the spinosum there, the part.
It's here somewhere.
Oh, last one?
Yeah, lacerum right there. And you can see the same thing. And notice it has a different appearance. I don't know if I cut off the Ackland video before we got to that. We'll look at another one in just a moment. But the carotid artery bends and moves around in there. So you'll see various illustrations of this that sometimes look a little different. I'm going to point out once again, this is the cribriform plate up here, which is part of the ethmoid bone. Remember, these are frontal bones over here, but this is the ethmoid. There's the quista galli, that ridge at the interior, and there's the cribriform plate, through which the bipolar neurons that afford you the olfactory sensation are located. We'll look at another little slide, which that's made clear a little later. And I guess the final thing that I would mention before we leave this, because there are other slides that show some details a little better. Remember, all of this is lined with dura mater. This is lined with the outermost layer of the meninges. And so the brain is going to rest on that meningeal layer. And of course, keep in mind too, as we talk about the dura mater, very thick, very robust. All of these structures that we've mentioned, all those neural structures and vascular structures, one way or another have to traverse, have to pass through that meninges. Sometimes it's fairly straightforward, opening on one side, opening on the other. Sometimes a structure will pass sort of parallel to the dura mater and then emerge. So again, the anatomy is going to be a little bit more complex than we have time to get into it here. So this is a comparable illustration. We're looking at the same things. I've pointed out in larger font here some of the things that you absolutely need to be able to identify. But once again, be able to differentiate the anterior, middle, and posterior fossa, be able to tell me what structures are on there. You can see the ROS here. You can see the three foramina we just looked at back here. In this graphic, they're along this little plane right here. What else here? We have the foramen magnum, through which the spinal cord passes the occipital bone. You have the jugular foramen back here. We'll talk a little bit about how the jugular veins transit the skull. And then, of course, the anterior ethmoid structures that we mentioned. So here's a slide that a couple of things to pay attention to on this slide. This is an important one. This is one you might want to highlight. Make sure you know you can identify all the structures here, not necessarily on this figure, because they're not all present on this figure, and not necessarily looking at the basic cranium from below, because now notice what we're doing. We flip the bottom of the skull, and we're looking at it from the bottom now instead of the top. But these you should know in general. We talked about the optic foramen. This is chiefly for the optic nerve. We saw an image of that opening just a moment ago. The superior orbital fissure, we said, is important because it transmits all three of the cranial nerves that move the eye. These are the extraocular muscles that move the eye in various positions, 3, 4, and 6. 3, 4, cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6. Their function is to position the eye. And so they're sometimes called extraocular or extrinsic eye muscles for that reason. And all three go through that superior orbital fissure. And also the superior branch of cranial nerve 5, which we call the ophthalmic branch, or V1. We're all aware, Apple had its recent, these sudden transitions, you may have to prepare yourself, but Apple just had its little conference, and they talked about changes to their operating system. Now, virtually all of you being Apple sophisticates, what is the current operating system for Apple?
That bird. Oh, that bird.
What is it?
OS.
Oh, what is the designation numeric? Yeah, 10. But that's how you always know an Apple person from a non-Apple person, because for everybody else it's OS X. Just they forget the Roman numerals. So what I want to point out here is that even though, and I've had students ask me this on a final exam, not so much in this course, what does the V or the VI stand for? So Cranial nerve 5, that's the Roman numeral V there. Anatomists for a long, long time, despite the fact that it stands for the great cranial nerve 5, refer to these branches as V1, V2, and V3. So I just alert you to that bit of peculiarity. So even though it's a Roman numeral, you'll still see references or neuroanatomists speak of V1, V2, and V3, and this is what they're talking about. So the spheroorbital fissure V1, cranial nerve first branch, foramen rotundum, which we saw a moment ago. You can see the ovale and the spinosum here. We really don't see the rotundum because it's sort of obscured by the pterygoid wing of the sphenoid there. Foramen rotundum, the maxillary, which is V2, foramen ovale, which you do see here, V3, or the mandibular branch. We'll have some more to say about that later. You can see the foramen spinosum that is most lateral, sort of most posterior along that branch, along that range of openings. The foramen lacerum, we've already indicated. Foramen lacerum is, notice that has a different appearance here. The artery actually goes this way. You can see the carotid canal here, but all of that's normally filled in vivo. The foramen lacerum is pretty much the passage for the internal carotid. The internal acoustic meatus, is it labeled here? It would be in this region. There's the external meatus. Don't confuse that with the internal meatus. This is your ear. The external auditory meatus is this aperture. The internal is important because it accommodates cranial nerves 7 and 8. They sort of branch off midway, but they're both in there for this for a time. Yeah.
Would internal acoustic meatus be synonymous with internal auditory meatus?
Correct. Yeah, you'll see. And I think there's even a third term that I can't recall that you used for the perfect meatus.
So this would be with regards to V2 and V3,
Which
7 and 8 with the internal acoustic.
No.
Is that what you were meaning?
No. So V2, the V stands for the Roman numeral 5.
Right.
So 7 and 8 are different cranial nerves.
So that wouldn't be V3 and V2, because that's technically V2.
Oh no. This is Roman numeral 7. And
yeah.
Okay. So it wouldn't be V2.
Okay.
You'll see, when you see that, you'll see a little 2 and a little 3.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, don't ask me why.
Okay.
It irritates all of us when we first do. Because you have, not only, as I understand your confusion now, use Arabic numbers for that designation. So you'd have the Roman numeral and then you'd have the Arabic number beside it.
Yeah.
At least that's the way I've always seen it. The jugular, we'll see a better illustration of that in just a moment. But that's kind of important because it provides the passageway through the skull for the cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11. 12 is missing because it passes through the hypoglossal canal, which is back here adjacent to the foramen magnum. I think what we're looking at here is something called the condylar canal, which is not terribly important. It's for a passage of small veins through the skull. Yeah.
Is the carotid canal is that a temporal bone that it's through?
The carotid canal is going to be, right there at the interface between the temporal and the sphenoid. And as I say, this whole structure, if you look at the other slide that you have, you'll see a little channel here because this in vivo is packed full. But when you take the skull out and dry it, you probably can go in here and look at the one in the other room. There's a little channel here. And sometimes, again, it's called the Lazarus channel, used by a variety of names. So the foramen magnum, back here, again, to accommodate the spinal cord. The vertebral arteries, the spinal leads of cranial nerve 11 accessory, all pass through there as well. We've talked about the quistigale. You can see, you should be able to identify ROS here. Here's the foramen lacerum, as I just talked about in the dry skull. And you can see the little green thing is intended to represent what? Anybody know? That's the carotid. Yeah, the carotid. Is that me pinging or somebody else? Because I will ping. So again, you can see the frame and lacrum here. You asked a good question because you can see it's right there between the two drawings. The foramen ovale, foramen spinosum here, the jugular foramen. We've already talked about accommodating more than just the jugular vein, and then the carotid artery. This isn't a particularly good picture, but you can see. I think this would be useful, for example, in identifying the major bones, the major plates of the skull. We talked about the condylar canal, which is here. These are the condyles here. This is the condylar canal. Not terribly important for our purposes. It's just it admits what's called an emissary vein, and we'll talk about emissary veins later. You will find better lists, but these are just lists of in case you want a thorough repository of all the foramina and what their function is in these two slides. But I think you'll probably find better lists online somewhere. See it up. Hold on just a second. I was in such a rush I didn't hook up the audio.
Now we'll move on to take a look at the openings in the floor of the anterior and middle cranial fossa that we saw earlier.
He sometimes seems a little sinister.
We'll look at 3 openings that pass forwards, 2 openings that pass downwards, and 1 that, in spite of appearances, passes obliquely backwards. We'll start with the ones that pass forwards. This round opening, just in front of the anterior clinoid process, is the optic canal for the optic nerve. Lateral to it, this large triangular opening is the superior orbital fissure, which we've seen already. Numerous nerves and blood vessels pass through it into the orbit. Below and behind the medial end of the superior orbital fissure, this smaller round opening, the foramen rotundum, is for the maxillary branch of the trigeminal nerve. We'll put this pointer in the foramen rotundum and go round to the outside. Here's the superior orbital fissure again. Here, medial to it, is the optic canal. The foramen rotundum emerges not into the orbit, but into the pterygomaxillary fissure. The 2 openings that pass downward are the foramen ovale for the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve, and just behind and lateral to it, the foramen spinosum for the middle meningeal artery. To see where those 2 come out, we'll go round to the underside. Here's the foramen ovale, just behind the lateral pterygoid plate. Here's the foramen spinosum, just behind and lateral to the foramen ovale. The last opening to look at is this untidy-looking opening, the foramen lacerum, for the internal carotid artery. In a dry skull, the appearance of the foramen lacerum is quite misleading. It appears to pass straight down through the base of the skull, emerging here at the tip of the petrous temporal bone. In the living body, the apparent opening on the underside is filled in with dense cartilage and fibrous tissue, represented by this material. Fibrous tissue also fills in this ragged part of the internal bony opening. What's left of the foramen lacerum is a clean-cut opening through which the internal carotid artery emerges from its obliquely running bony tunnel, the carotid canal. The other end of the carotid canal, as we saw in the previous section, is back here, just medial to the styloid process. In front of the opening for the carotid canal, there's one further opening that we haven't seen yet, the opening for the auditory tube, also called the eustachian tube. The auditory tube passes backwards and laterally to emerge here in the middle ear. The auditory tube is longer than this. Medially, it's prolonged by a tube of cartilage, represented by this colored material. The auditory tube opens into the nasopharynx, as we'll see.
Now, there was a question earlier about the auditory hiatus. Don't confuse the auditory tube, what we call most commonly the eustachian tube, with the auditory hiatus. We'll fight that battle a little later. But remember from your exhaustive study of Shakespeare, wasn't it Hamlet that poisoned, or Hamlet's father was poisoned with the toxin placed into the ear? So what would, in order for Hamlet's father to die, what would have had to be true anatomically? Right, there'd have to be some passageway for the poison to get from the outer ear into the interior of the body, the throat or something. But you notice what he said. Where does that eustachian tube? It goes from the throat to what part of the middle, not the outer. So anatomically, Shakespeare was a little bit off. So in an illustration like this, if I were to, and I think at this point you can really identify most of these structures. I think if you just look around and look at some of those labels, I think you already know them. But at the very least, again, labels removed, be able to differentiate the cranial compartment, the nasal compartment, the buccal or oral compartment. Be able to, if I were to ask you what bony structure separates the compartments, be able to do that. You can see, for example, you can see the concave of the nasal compartment of the turbinates. You can see the sphenoid back here, the large sphenoid sinus, the frontal sinuses anterior and superior. You should be able to identify and know what the crista galli is here. Of course, that's going to be surrounded by the cribriform structures. You can see the little suture here separating the sphenoid from the occipital bone. You can see this is a very important structure that we mentioned earlier. That's going to be the Turkish saddle, the sella turcica, the hypophyseal fossa there where the pituitary gland rests. There are also some channels here. We'll talk about some of these in just a moment, or we'll get today. But these are furrows, depressions in the skull to accommodate the cranial sinuses. The cranial sinuses. Now, in general, sinus, not always, but in general, sinus means opening of some type. And so this channel is a channel that reflects depression of sort of a Martian canal, if you will. I'll use my silly analogies today, to accommodate the flow of venous blood, cranial blood. We'll look at some of those channels and how they all come together. And you can see the depressions in the skull that accommodates the meningeal artery, the middle meningeal artery. We'll look at that in more detail in just a moment. So you know the parts of the bone. For example, the mandible, you're going to differentiate the angle. You know what the lingula is up here, this little ridge of bone to accommodate the alveolar nerve. Alveolar nerve being a branch of the mandibular nerve. It's going to go right through here and then ramify to innervate, for example, the mandibular alveolus. You know what's a mandibular alveolus? Yeah, the gomphoses, the dentition. So there's going to be a maxillary alveolus and the mandibular. Yeah, so I think that would be useful practice to just spend some time with an illustration like that and be able to identify all the critical bony markings and structures. In that video, in the Ackman video, there was reference to the pterygopalatine fossa, sometimes called the sphenopalatine fossa, because it's just the separation, the little opening between the two bones, between the palatine and the sphenoid bone of the pterygo. It just refers to the pterygoid processes of the sphenoid. Now, you remember we talked about the infratemporal fossa. So here's the ramus here, and then deep to that is the infratemporal fossa. So everything deep to or inside that zygomatic ramus there That's going to be the infratemporal fossa. And all this slide is pointing out is that V3, the mandibular branch, passes down and inside that. That's not a very high degree of anatomical precision, but I just want to remind you what we mean by the infratemporal fossa. And then also within the infratemporal fossa, that large depression inside the ramus, ramus has been removed here. Here's where those two bones come together, palatine and the sphenoid. So there's a little opening right here, and that's where V2, the maxillary branch, but it too is part of, or at least the anterior portion of, the infratemporal fossa. So you can see that here's our massive cranial nerve 5 ganglion. It's also called the semilunar ganglion. It's also called the Gasserian ganglion. It's also called the DRG of the brain. What's DRG stand for? Dorsal root ganglion. Now, why would this thing be called the dorsal root ganglion of the brain? Because what does the DRG do along your spinal cord? Sensory, yeah. And this big thing here is primarily a large sensory ganglion inside the cranium. But then you have a couple of problems here that should be troubling you. It's a ganglion. What do we know about the term ganglion? Exactly. Where would we normally find them? Yeah, outside the CNS. And so we could quibble about that. But this is a ganglion because most of these, well, I won't say that, but all of these cranial nerves, this will be true, all of these cranial nerves originate in the spinal cord, but more specifically originate within nuclei of the spinal cord. So make sure you know that. The cranial nerves originate, I should say brainstem, originate within nuclei of the brainstem. The cranial nerves originate within nuclei of the brainstem. And then, in a few cases, this one being the most prominent, within just a few millimeters of their leaving the brainstem nucleus, this happens. It becomes much larger. The little projection, the cranial nerve 5 nucleus, as it leaves, then explodes into this large structure, which we then call a ganglion. And as I say, it goes by a variety of names. It has 3 major branches here, 1, 2, 3, ophthalmic, mandibular, and maxillary. And the whole thing is primarily sensory, with one major exception. V3, in addition to being sensory, is also motor. And we'll talk more about this later, but since we're looking at such a nice picture over here. So the mandibular branch is the only motor branch of cranial nerve 5. And it innervates the muscles of mastication. And what are the muscles of mastication? Yes, chewing. So just a lot of little anatomical terms to sort of keep straight there. And we'll talk about the region of innervation in more detail later. I just wanted you to be aware of some of these the terms that are used to describe the bony structures, the cranial structures. One curious phenomenon that we encounter in these cranial bones are the sinuses. We've already seen the sphenoid sinus. Here we're looking at some of the paranasal sinuses, para meaning beside the nasal region. You can see the frontal sinuses, large anterior sinuses above the head. These are just vacuities of the frontal bone. You can see adjacent to the nasal cavity are you really don't see them here. They're called nasal air cells. They're just little depressions, little pockets, vacuities in the bone. And then lateral to that, you can see these much larger maxillary sinuses. And the curious thing about these is that while they're just pretty much vacant bone tissue, they are aligned, for the most part, with ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And what do you know about ciliated epithelium? What's its function?
Sweet.
Yeah, it's basically, so very curious, the interior lining of these sinuses, for the most part, is lined with this epithelium. They secrete constitutive bases, fluid, mucosal fluid, and normally that's absorbed in by a variety of mechanisms. By one mechanism, you can see here the fluid. This is not normal. If your sinus is like this, you've got a problem. You've got a sinus infection. But whatever fluid is in here, whatever moisture is in there, is normally vacated or ciliated or pumped, if you will, pushed into the nasal cavity where it drains that way. You can decide what you want to do with it once it gets into the nasal cavity. Here we're looking, of course, at an infection. And so sometimes the poor ciliated epithelium becomes overwhelmed with the volume of fluid that it has to contend with. And of course, those infections could arise for a variety of reasons. Why do we have sinuses? Anybody have any theories there?
Good question.
Yeah, I think both of you are right. I heard a couple of answers there about reducing the weight of the mass of the skull. I think that's very important. There are a lot of bones, and we have the cancellous bone in our epiphyses and the hollow medullary bone in part. Have any of you, I think they're probably, they keep changing, but I think they're probably plastic. I don't think they're real skeletons in there. But have any of you ever picked up an actual human skeleton? How heavy is it? What's the weight, would you say? Is it something you have to put your shoulder into? No, it's very, very light. Very, very light. You would have no trouble picking it up with one hand, with fingertips. So that's in part why. Yeah, and then you've probably seen, they seem to have a dinosaur of the day, but every day now. I read about a new dinosaur being discovered. No one else is reading about the dinosaurs that are being discovered. But some of them have these massive ridges, and others will have, as I look at the pictures, because I'm kind of fond of dinosaurs, they'll have these large turbinate horns and so on. And the theory is that those were intended to, for acoustical purposes, perhaps to attract mate, perhaps to announce their territory. But in any case, these sinuses do contribute to the resonance of the voice. And of course, professional vocalists learn how to optimize that resonance. We've talked about the terminology of bone fractures earlier. A lot of the terminology is continuous with our discussion here. The problem with fractures of the skull, bony structural problems, is that it's not so much the bone that's the issue here, it's what's inside the bone that gets the problem. Both the cranial tissue, both the brain itself can be damaged, but in association with the brain, we talked a little bit about this, are the meninges and the meningeal vessels. And oftentimes a relatively minor cranial fracture can result in extensive bleeding. And as that bleeding continues, there's no place for that blood to go. It's trapped within that cranial cavity, and it's that compression on the neural structures and associated structures that can be most problematic. Consequently, you're probably familiar if you watch any primetime television. Whenever somebody gets knocked on the head, what's the first thing they have to do? In fact, I saw a show one time where they were caught in a mine. One of the miners got bonked in the head, and he was saved when they pulled out a power drill. This is what happens on primetime television. There's this, yeah, something like that. They came shooting out, and everybody was happy. But you get the idea. So the same the terminology we learned before: simple, linear. Depression, as we've indicated, can be complicated by the implications for the neural tissue and the blood vessels. Compound fracture. The problem, once again, here is not only the depression issues, but the possible risk of infection. We say, or we did say, that the CNS is immunologically privileged. What does that mean? Why would this be a problem for an immunologically privileged tissue? What kind of immune system does your CNS have? It's got its own little microglia. I don't recall. Did we talk about microglia? I think we need to talk about the microglia. It has its own little specialized system, but we used to think, I say used to because I'm so confused now, I don't know what to believe anymore. Remember I told you there was a recent discovery in which apparently there are extensive lymphatic vessels into your brain. And so I think that still needs to work out. Something needs to be worked out. Somebody needs to replicate this fellow's study and prove it. In any case, one way or the other, the possibility of infection, neural infection, can be quite serious on a compound fraction. We've talked about comminution. Be sure you know that term. It just means that in this case, you have fragmentation of the skull. The fragments now may be embedded in the neural tissue. Contra coup is going to be something you'll learn about in your patho courses more extensively. Contra coup implies that if you have an immediate trauma on one side of the head, and what's the brain going to do inside your brain case? Boom. The anterior brain is going to slam against the front of the skull, and then it's built in the CSF. What's it immediately going to do once it slams into the anterior of the skull? Boom! It slams into the back of the skull. And oftentimes, not only will there be a contra coup type injury, taking care especially of bullet type injuries and very powerful assaults on the cranial cavity, you'll have not only damage to the cranium, but there may even be contra coup damage to the skull. You often see this in bullet type wounds, which is a contra coup right there. And then we've talked about the pterygium, and we'll look at the middle meningeal artery in a little more detail in just a moment. But the general principle we'll learn is that the external carotid supplies the outside of the cranium for the most part. But the middle meningeal is a little bit of an odd animal. It's a branch of the external carotid. It's a branch of the maxillary. We'll talk about that artery later. But it really perfuses and supplies the interior, just the immediate interior of the skull. We'll see why that's critical in a moment. And again, any damage to the skull can cause bleeding there, and thus you get either intradural or extradural hematomas.
I was going to ask, the contribute fracture and the fracture of the bone as a result of the brain within the skull?
Well, in many cases, it's not clear, but that seems to be. Think of your brain, and the interior brain, as hydraulic fluid. What do you know about hydraulic fluid? And again, I should preface this by saying sometimes we don't know what causes the contra coup injury. But if you, for example, you read, when you're not reading about dinosaurs, you're probably reading about Lincoln's assassination. And that was one of the curious things discovered or reported in the Lincoln, the forensic, thank you, autopsy of Lincoln's skull, is that there was a damage to the skull on the opposite side of the gunshot wound. But this has been known for a long time. Oftentimes you do have, as I was saying, damage to the skull and or the neural tissue. But the point I was making, if you think of the interior of the skull, the CSF, blood, this isn't exactly true, but think of it as a hydraulic volume in there. Fluids are incompressible. And so maybe it's part of it. But I think if you look at if you were to talk to a mechanical engineer, they would tell you that it has more to do with the way that the stresses are distributed around the skull. I'm not an expert on that. Just a sort of a silly conclusion here. If you watch any of these, again, forensic shows, there have been 17 different forensics shows now in different parts of the country, different parts of the world, different parts of the galaxy. And then you have programs like Bones, and you know that the stars of these shows can immediately look at a bone and tell you how old. They can look at a finger bone and tell you that was a 33-year-old office worker from the Queens who was out for a stroll with his dog on Tuesday evening, and they can give you all sorts. So don't make too much of this, but there are general trends regarding the gender dimorphology or sex dimorphology of the cranium. In general, the male skull bone tends to be a little larger, a little thicker, they're more angular. The bones tend to be a little more robust in certain areas, especially in the mandible, the jawbone, and so on. Again, vindicate the males tend to have a more blockish or squarish shape to the head. And there's all kinds of literature, if any of you are interested in this, to suggest that. I just put this in to annoy some of you and maybe to get you to write nasty letters to the editor or something. There's a lot of research out there to suggest that women prefer blockhead males, that is to say males with very, very square, angular jaws and prominent jaw bones and so on prior to ovulation. But then after ovulation, they tend to prefer a more feminine face. So what would be the logic of that? You want a virile male for the fun stuff, but once you're saddled at home with some rugrats, you want a guy to hang around, help you take care of the kids. In any case, that's the evolutionary biological perspective, and I'll let you reflect on that as we take a break. So let's take a break.